The wind carried an unnatural chill that night, the kind that makes even the bravest men feel watched. In the dense forests beyond Brookhaven, Massachusetts, the air hung still, muffled by the weight of snow and something unseen. The cabin stood there half-eaten by moss, its windows blackened, its chimney long cold. Inside, a single object waited beneath the dust, a doctor's journal, its ink smudged, the edges stiff with time. When the students pried it open, a scent of something sour escaped, like soil that had once cradled flesh. The first page was dated February 3, 1847. It began simply, "The patient was brought to me at dusk. Female, mid-20s. No pulse. Yet her eyes followed me." That line alone made them stop reading for a moment. The further they read, the more the handwriting trembled, sentences collapsing into frantic loops and scratches. Dr. Elias Warren had not written like a man, he had written like someone trying to trap a thought before it devoured him. The journal spoke of a woman called Latoya, found lying on frozen ground, her body perfectly preserved as if the frost had chosen her. There were sketches of her face, eyes wide, unblinking, and an expression that seemed aware of the artist's gaze. Warren wrote that her temperature was colder than ice, and yet her lips would part in sleep, releasing faint trails of mist as though she breathed from somewhere deep below the earth. As the candlelight flickered, one of the students thought he saw something move across the reflection of the page, something pale and deliberate. The others laughed it off, yet none of them dared to look toward the cabin's darkened window. Somewhere outside, a branch cracked under a weight too heavy to be wind. And from deep within the forest, a soft knock echoed, a rhythm like a heartbeat, patient and waiting. By the time they closed the journal, the night had grown impossibly silent. The youngest among them whispered, "It's just a story." But the others noticed his hands trembling, and how his breath fogged the air despite the fire still burning at his side. What none of them realized, not yet, was that the story of Latoya wasn't over. It was listening. In the biting cold of early winter, a group of medical students from Boston University embarked on a journey that was supposed to be an educational retreat into the woods of Massachusetts. The year was 1847, and medical science was teetering on the edge of discovery and superstition. Their professor, a man known for his fascination with anatomy and the study of death, had encouraged them to explore beyond the walls of the city to understand the body in its most natural state. So they set out toward the forest that bordered the quiet town of Brookhaven, carrying little more than their notebooks, surgical kits, and a curiosity that bordered on arrogance. The woods were dense, old, and eerily quiet, the kind of silence that seemed to absorb their voices rather than echo them. As the light faded and snow began to fall, they stumbled upon what looked like the remains of a small cabin, swallowed by vines and years of neglect. The students entered cautiously, their boots creaking on the warped wooden floorboards. The air inside was thick with the odor of rot and mold, but beneath it lingered a faint metallic scent, something like dried blood. It was there, near the collapsed hearth, that one of them noticed a strange object protruding from the dirt. Brushing away the debris, they uncovered what appeared to be a leather-bound journal, its cover warped and stiff from moisture. The initials EW were etched faintly on the spine. Intrigued, the group gathered around as the eldest among them carefully pried it open, revealing pages stained with watermarks and dark blotches of ink. The first few entries were mundane notes on anatomy, sketches of bone structures, and discussions about fever and mortality. But as they turned the pages, the tone shifted. The handwriting grew more frantic, the words describing events that defied medical logic. The entries spoke of a woman found deep within the woods, untouched by decay, her eyes open and unclouded even after death. The students read on, each word feeding their growing unease. It became clear that this was not just a physician's research, it was a confession. The final entry trailed off mid-sentence, the ink smudged as if written in panic. Outside, the wind howled against the broken windows, and one of the students swore he heard a faint knocking sound echoing from beneath the floorboards. None of them wanted to admit it, but all felt the same sensation, like the forest itself was listening. When they finally left the cabin, the journal clutched tightly in their hands, the snow had covered their footprints behind them, erasing all trace of their presence. But in the stillness of the trees, something unseen stirred, as if awakened by their discovery. The journal the students discovered bore the unmistakable mark of Dr. Elias Warren, a name that once echoed through Boston's medical circles before vanishing from every record in 1847. He had been regarded as a brilliant but controversial physician, obsessed with cases that blurred the line between science and superstition. Colleagues had whispered about his fascination with life after cessation, a phrase he used to describe the possibility of consciousness persisting after death. When the students realized whose journal they were holding, a hush fell over the group. Dr. Warren had disappeared almost 2 decades earlier, leaving behind no body, no explanation, and no closure for those who once studied under him. His name had become a warning in medical academia, an example of genius consumed by madness. Yet here, in the rotting shell of a forgotten cabin, lay his missing record, preserved as though the forest itself had kept it hidden for a reason. As the students pored over the journal by the flickering light of their lantern, the atmosphere grew heavier with every page. The early entries chronicled his travels from Boston to the outskirts of Brookhaven, where he had gone to investigate strange reports of illness and hysteria spreading among isolated families. But what began as a simple medical study quickly descended into something far darker. The writing described sleepless nights, disembodied whispers, and a growing sense that he was being followed through the woods by unseen figures. He mentioned a presence that seemed to linger near the clinic he established in an abandoned farmhouse, something that watched him in the reflection of glass, yet vanished when he turned around. The most chilling revelation came in the form of an unfinished letter tucked between 2 pages. It was addressed to the Massachusetts Medical Board, though it had never been sent. In it, Dr. Warren wrote of a patient named Latoya, a young woman found unconscious but breathing shallowly despite the absence of any pulse or heartbeat. He claimed her body resisted decay, that her temperature never rose above freezing, and that her pupils contracted even in complete darkness. His tone alternated between awe and dread, admitting that he could not classify her condition within the boundaries of human medicine. The letter ended abruptly with a warning, *, do not follow where I have gone. Some truths are not meant to be revived. *. The students stared at one another, their faces pale, their curiosity now tainted by fear. Outside, the night pressed closer against the cabin walls, as though the forest itself disapproved of what they were reading. The name Elias Warren no longer felt like that of a man, it felt like the beginning of something that should have stayed buried. The deeper the students read into Dr. Elias Warren's journal, the more it became apparent that the heart of his disappearance revolved around a single name, Latoya. The doctor's entries shifted from detached medical observation to a tone bordering on obsession. He wrote that Latoya had been brought to his small clinic by a group of townspeople from Brookhaven who claimed she was untouched by time. They found her lying in a clearing within the forest, her skin cold but unmarked, her lips slightly parted as though caught between breathing and silence. The villagers believed she had died days earlier, yet her body showed no sign of decay. Her clothes were damp but free from soil, her hair matted with frost that did not melt even beside a fire. When Dr. Warren examined her, he noted that her pupils responded faintly to light, and her body emitted a low hum beneath the stethoscope, something he described as vibrations of life not yet extinguished. The entries revealed that Latoya could speak, but what she said terrified those around her. On her first night at the clinic, she whispered in a language none could understand, words that rolled off her tongue like fragments of ancient prayer. Dr. Warren, whose education had included studies of Latin and Greek, could identify traces of neither. He noted that she sometimes shifted mid-sentence into patterns resembling Sumerian or even Egyptian hieroglyphic phonetics, yet the words carried a rhythm that felt deliberate, as if she were reciting something from memory. The townspeople who had brought her refused to stay after hearing her speak, claiming that her voice didn't belong to her at all but to something that used her mouth. Dr. Warren's fascination deepened as he tried to record her speech, sketching her posture, the position of her eyes, and the peculiar stillness of her movements. He began to write that she seemed aware of being studied, that her gaze followed him even when her head did not move. His notes described her presence as calm yet expectant, as though she were waiting for something or someone. When questioned about her origins, she uttered only one sentence in perfect English, *, you called me here, doctor. *, that was the moment his tone shifted entirely from scientific curiosity to dread. The following pages showed erratic ink patterns, smudges, and fragmented thoughts about sleep deprivation and the sensation of cold hands brushing across his face while he wrote. To the students reading the account decades later, it was clear that Latoya was not merely a patient, she was a catalyst, something unnatural that had stepped out of the woods to answer a call no one remembered making. The next entries in Dr. Warren's journal chronicled the moment when science began to surrender to terror. After days of observation, Latoya's body continued to defy the principles of decay. Her skin remained pale but unblemished, her hair retained its sheen, and there was no stiffness to her limbs despite the absence of heartbeat or breath. The doctor wrote that her body temperature never rose above 30 degrees, and yet, under candlelight, he occasionally thought he saw her chest rise faintly, as though a hidden rhythm pulsed within. The nurses under his care had already grown uneasy, whispering that the patient's stillness was too complete, her silence too deliberate. One night, when Warren leaned over to examine her lips for discoloration, he felt a faint exhalation, cold and damp, brush across his cheek. He froze, uncertain whether it was imagination or a draft from the window, but then Latoya's lips parted slightly, releasing a thin wisp of fog that lingered in the lamplight. When he stepped back, her eyes fluttered open for the first time. They were not the clouded eyes of the dead but sharp, lucid, and strangely aware. Dr. Warren later wrote that it felt as if the room itself had drawn in a breath with her. He stammered her name, half in fear, half in fascination. Then, in a voice so faint it could barely be heard, Latoya whispered, "Dr. Warren." The words were not questioning, they were remembering. Panic spread through the clinic as one of the nurses dropped her lantern, spilling oil across the floor. The staff fled into the hallway, some praying, others crying that she had spoken though she had no life in her. Warren remained still, trembling, torn between awe and disbelief. He tried to speak to her, asking who she was, but her gaze only shifted toward the window, where frost had begun to creep inward in curling, vine-like patterns. Her lips moved again, but no sound came, only the soft rattle of air as though she were trying to form words from another world. The following morning, Warren's notes became disordered, his scientific tone dissolving into scattered fragments of fear. He wrote of dreams where he saw her standing in the forest, her body surrounded by mist, her eyes reflecting the moonlight. He confessed that the sound of her whisper had not left his mind, echoing even when he slept. He began to suspect that Latoya had not been found by accident, that she had been waiting, and his arrival had simply given her a voice to speak again. The clinic grew colder each night after that, and no fire could keep the frost from spreading across the walls. Dr. Warren's notes from that point on reflected a descent from reason into something far darker, as though the boundaries between his mind and the world around him were slowly dissolving. He began recording strange occurrences that defied all logic, events that others in the clinic also noticed but refused to speak about aloud. He wrote that every night, just after midnight, the temperature in Latoya's room would drop suddenly, the air growing so cold that the lantern flames flickered blue before dying out completely. He described a smell that accompanied the chill, faint but persistent, like wet soil mixed with iron. It seeped through the walls, clung to his clothes, and followed him even into his dreams. Sometimes, when he would awake, he found muddy footprints leading from the examination table to the window, though the panes remained locked from the inside. At first, he suspected the nurses of playing cruel tricks, but their terrified faces told a different story. The doctor's handwriting grew erratic in these sections of the journal, letters slanting as though written by a trembling hand. He wrote about hearing faint tapping sounds behind the walls, rhythmic and deliberate, like the heartbeat of the building itself. The sound came most often when Latoya's eyes were open, staring blankly toward the ceiling. He recorded that she began to change, her skin taking on a faint, almost luminous pallor under moonlight, and when he leaned close, he thought he could hear whispers not from her mouth, but from somewhere deep within her chest, layered voices murmuring in unison. At one point, he attempted to move her body to another room, but every attempt failed. The nurses refused to help, and when he tried alone, her body felt impossibly heavy, as though rooted to the floor. Warren confessed that he started keeping a mirror beside her bed, hoping to catch whatever his eyes might miss. One night, he wrote that her reflection did not move when she did. Instead, it lingered a second behind, turning its gaze toward him with unmistakable awareness. That was when his scientific detachment crumbled completely. He began sleeping in his office, refusing to close his eyes fully, convinced that something was watching him through the cracks in the walls. The final lines from that period were almost illegible, smeared with what looked like ash. He mentioned the knocking returning, stronger this time, as though it came from beneath the floorboards. The last coherent note from that night read, ** She knows I'm writing. The knocking stops when I stop. **. By the time the 6th week passed, the atmosphere in the clinic had turned unbearable. The once bustling halls were now silent, filled only with the echo of dripping water and the faint creak of wood settling in the cold. The nurses whispered among themselves that Latoya's presence was poisoning the place, that even the air seemed thinner around her room. None dared to go near her after nightfall. The last nurse assigned to tend her, a young woman named Margaret, had begun reporting strange sounds coming from beneath the floorboards, soft crying that seemed to rise from under Latoya's bed. At first, Dr. Warren dismissed it as the sound of shifting pipes or the wind playing tricks on her nerves, but when he pressed his ear to the wooden planks one evening, he too heard it, a muffled weeping, distant yet unmistakably human. The sound seemed to move, sliding beneath the boards as if circling the room. Within days, Margaret vanished. Her bed was untouched, her coat still hanging by the door, and the last entry in her personal logbook simply read, ** She is not asleep anymore. *. The disappearance shattered what little sanity remained among the staff. Several fled in the middle of the night, leaving behind their medical instruments and belongings. Those who stayed described the same recurring nightmare, wandering through the woods at night, hearing their own names whispered from the trees, and seeing Latoya's face reflected in every pool of water. The constable of Brookhaven, summoned after Margaret's disappearance, arrived with a small group of men to inspect the premises. According to Warren's account, the moment they stepped into the clinic, their lanterns dimmed as though the flame itself hesitated. They found no trace of the missing nurse, only a dark stain on the floor near Latoya's bed that would not wash away, no matter how much lye they used. The constable, shaken by what he saw, ordered the immediate closure of the clinic and demanded that Warren vacate the property by morning. The doctor pleaded for more time, insisting that he was on the brink of understanding something beyond human medicine, but his words fell on deaf ears. That night, Warren recorded the last interactions he had with the authorities, how they refused to stay until sunrise, how they left hurriedly without looking back, and how he stood alone in the doorway, listening to the sound of the forest breathing around him. In the silence that followed, he wrote that the crying beneath the floor had stopped, replaced by something worse, a steady, rhythmic tapping that seemed to echo from inside the walls, following him from room to room as though counting down to something only it understood. After the authorities ordered the clinic's closure, Dr. Warren disobeyed their command and retreated deeper into the woods, taking Latoya with him. His journal revealed a state of mind that had crossed from scientific obsession into delusion. He claimed that Latoya could not be moved through ordinary means, her body grew heavy as stone when anyone else tried to lift her, yet she followed him willingly when he asked her to come. He described leading her through the trees in silence, her bare feet leaving no impression in the snow. He found shelter in an abandoned cabin, a place that the locals had long avoided, believing it to be cursed. The doctor wrote that he chose it precisely for that reason, its isolation, its distance from curious eyes, and the feeling that it had once been touched by something otherworldly. There, he intended to study her without interference, to document what he believed was the single most extraordinary biological phenomenon in human history. In the beginning, he maintained a tone of control. He measured her pulse, or what resembled one, through the faintest tremor in her throat. He noted that she required no food or water but seemed to react to the phases of the moon, growing visibly stronger under its light. He began conducting experiments with light and reflection, observing her through mirrors and glass surfaces. What he recorded next, however, blurred the line between scientific observation and madness. He wrote that Latoya's reflection began to move out of sync with her physical body, hesitating for a moment longer, blinking a fraction of a second late, and sometimes turning its head toward him even when she did not. At first, he thought fatigue was distorting his vision, but as days passed, he could no longer deny it. In one particularly chilling entry, Warren described standing behind her as she stared into a cracked mirror. Her reflection smiled faintly, though her lips did not. When he stepped back, the reflection's gaze followed him, its eyes bright and knowing. That night, he claimed he could hear soft breathing behind him as he wrote, though Latoya remained motionless in her chair. His tone grew increasingly fearful, referring to her as it instead of her. He wrote of hearing voices in the wind outside, whispering his name, calling him to finish what was begun. He stopped eating, stopped sleeping, and wrote that the forest had grown unnaturally quiet, as if listening to every heartbeat he still had left. His last clear thought in that section of the journal read, "I am no longer studying her. I believe she is studying me." Days after Dr. Warren retreated to the cabin, the townspeople of Brookhaven began noticing a strange light glowing faintly through the trees at night. It appeared at irregular intervals, sometimes a soft flicker, sometimes a steady pulse, always emanating from the same part of the forest where the doctor had last been seen. Rumors spread quickly, carried from taverns to church steps, each story darker than the last. Some said Warren had gone mad and set fire to his instruments, others whispered that he had raised something from the dead. After several nights of these strange lights, a small group of men gathered the courage to investigate. Armed with lanterns and rifles, they followed the faint trail into the woods, guided by the pale shimmer that seemed to beckon them deeper. The closer they drew to the source, the quieter the forest became, until even the wind seemed to hold its breath. When they reached the cabin, they found the door slightly ajar, swinging gently as though it had been opened moments before. The air inside was thick with the scent of smoke and something metallic. Their lanterns illuminated a scene that none of them would ever forget. The room was littered with papers, pages torn from Warren's journal, scattered like leaves, covered in frantic handwriting and smeared ink. On the table lay a series of anatomical sketches, each depicting the same thing, a pair of eyes, drawn over and over, open wide and staring. Some were marked with strange circular symbols around the pupils, others with lines that resembled veins spreading like roots. The sketches were detailed, obsessive, and deeply unsettling. In the corner, a single chair faced a cracked mirror. When one of the men raised his lantern, they saw that the mirror was fogged from within, as if something had been breathing on the other side of the glass. The chair was empty, but the floor around it bore deep scratches, as though someone or something had clawed at the wood in desperation. There was no sign of Dr. Warren, no sign of Latoya, only the journal, its last entry written in a trembling hand. The words were almost illegible, but what they could make out read, "She is awake now. She knows the light belongs to her." Terrified, the men fled, abandoning everything behind them. The next morning, when a few dared to return, the cabin was silent and cold, the air heavy with a strange calm. Only the sketches remained, staring from the table, their eyes wide and unblinking, as if waiting for someone to look back. The medical students who discovered Dr. Warren's journal could not leave the story behind once they returned to Boston. At first, they dismissed the experience as nothing more than the unnerving relic of a disturbed man's mind, but the further they read and discussed the entries among themselves, the more the events of that night began to cling to them like a shadow. The youngest among them, Henry Clark, was the first to admit that he had been dreaming of the cabin. In his sleep, he said he walked through snow-covered woods, the path lit by a faint blue light that pulsed in the distance. Each time he drew closer, he saw a figure waiting by the doorway, a woman whose face he could never fully see but whose eyes he always recognized. Soon, the others began to experience the same dreams. They would wake with frost on their windows, their hearts pounding, convinced they could still hear the echo of someone whispering their names. As days passed, the dreams grew more vivid. One student described seeing pages from the journal fluttering through the woods like falling leaves, while another claimed to hear the sound of a quill scratching just beyond the edge of his vision, as though someone continued the doctor's writings in secret. Their shared visions became so consistent that they began to suspect the journal itself was the source of their torment. When they attempted to destroy it, however, something stopped them. One of them swore that the ink began to run before the fire could reach it, forming words that weren't there before. Another insisted that the pages turned on their own, revealing entries none of them remembered reading earlier. The haunting intensified when the group decided to separate for a few nights in hopes of breaking the strange connection between them. Yet, isolation only made things worse. Henry was found wandering near the edge of the city 3 days later, barefoot and trembling, his clothes soaked as though he had been walking through snow. He could barely speak, his mouth muttering the same phrase over and over, "the woman in the glass." His hands were raw, marked with small cuts shaped like crescents, as if he had been clawing at something invisible. The journal, which they had locked away, was discovered open on the table in their lodging, its final page bearing a new line in handwriting none of them recognized. Asterisk, you saw me once. Now I see you. Asterisk, from that night onward, none of the remaining students dared to read another word aloud, though the soft scratching of a pen sometimes echoed in the room long after the lamps had gone out. The weeks following Henry Clark's breakdown left the remaining students in a state of silent dread. They avoided speaking of the journal, but its presence lingered in every glance and pause between them. Each of them had begun to feel watched, even in the heart of Boston where the noise of the city should have drowned out such fears. It wasn't paranoia they felt, it was recognition, as though something had followed them back from the forest and now lingered just beyond the edge of sight. When winter returned and the first snow began to fall, the nightmares resumed with renewed intensity. Each dream was the same: the woods of Brookhaven, the flickering cabin light, and the faint reflection of a woman standing behind them in the glass. Their waking hours brought no relief. The temperature in their lodgings would drop without reason, frost would form in strange patterns across their windows, and at night, they would hear the faint sound of knocking, 3 slow, deliberate taps that seemed to come from within the walls. One evening, one of the students disappeared, leaving behind only a half-burned candle and a note that read, Asterisk, she calls from the light. Asterisk, the others searched frantically, but their efforts led nowhere. Days later, a traveler passing through Brookhaven reported seeing a figure wandering near the sealed path to the woods, a man dressed in city clothes, muttering to himself and carrying what looked like a leather-bound book. The description matched the missing student. The local authorities followed the report, reopening the investigation into the forest that had long been left undisturbed since Warren's disappearance. When they ventured near the cabin's ruins, they found the structure partially collapsed under snow, the air within unnaturally cold despite the season's mildness. On the table lay a single candle still burning, its flame unwavering in the wind, and on the walls were faint marks resembling handprints pressed into the wood. There was no sign of the missing man, nor any trace of the journal he was said to be carrying. After that night, the authorities sealed the forest completely, posting warnings and declaring the area cursed. Yet every November, just before the first snowfall, travelers still reported seeing strange blue lights flickering between the trees. Some swore they heard the faint echo of weeping, while others claimed to see the outline of a woman standing near the cabin's remains, her reflection visible even when she herself seemed to fade into the mist. The legend of Latoya became a whispered curse among locals, a story too dangerous to tell after dark, for fear that something might listen and remember its name.